Okay, so we continue our morning with the IPT, and now you will have the lecture of Sara Garcês talking about the rock art of Tagus Valley. Thank you very much, Sara.
You're welcome, Marta. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I will talk today about the methodology that we have been working in Tagus Valley rock art. I will show you a little bit of how what exists in the Tagus Valley in rock art these days, the type of work that we've been developing in the last years, and the news. We have some good news about the work that we've been doing here. So I will show you a little bit of everything. So the area that I'm going to speak about, it's literally in the center of Portugal, here in the Tagus Valley, and it's a very interesting story because it was found out. All the rock art was found by chance. It was lucky. In 1971, a group of archaeologists went to this area to do Paleolithic studies in another themes, in another things. They were not looking for rock art, but yet because of a tip from an ethnographer, a local ethnographer, that said that people said that were written stones in the Tagus, they decided to check this tip, and they found out thousands of engravings in a very big area. So the area started to be 40 kilometers. All these yellow triangulars correspond to the sites that they found out that there were rock art. It's not one rock or two rocks. It was hundreds of rocks in each site. So they decided to change their mind and do some work in these engravings, because they also found out that there was a dam, Fratel Dam, that was being built, and this would make a big impact on these engravings. So literally the engravings, most of the engravings would be submerged by this dam, and they had to do something about it. So all this area is actually very impacted already for 3 dams, not only Fratel Dam. Fratel Dam, it's the one here and on the left below, but this area already had 2 other dams, and it was already being a lot influenced by this dynamic. But Fratel Dam would put most of the rock art that existed underwater. So they at the time they spent here, they only had more or less 2 years to do some work on the engravings before everything would be submerged, or most of the rock art would be submerged. Just to tell you that this rock art started to be assessed in the first 40 kilometers of Tagus until the border with Spain. And then after decades, in 2005-6 more or less, we also found in both sides, in Portugal side and in Spanish side. So for this work, I will consider not the first 40 kilometers of the river, but we decided to consider all this region, because the rock art that it was found in the Edges River, it's exactly the same typology, chronology that is in these first 40 kilometers. So the big area now, it's considered to be 120 kilometers of rock art. So this part is really important because for all the methodology approach that we did after, we need to take into account the type of material that we have. And because they didn't have time to do the typical tracing of rock art engravings, they found thousands of engravings, most of them, sorry, they were in horizontal schist banks, like Professor Stabak said. not 100% of it, but 99% of it was in horizontal, very big schist banks. And they didn't have time enough to do a proper assessment of this rock art. So they decided to use a technique that was quite famous in the 70s, I must say. It was used in other places, that consisted of doing the latex moldage, the molds of the top of the rivers, of the top of the rocks. I'm sorry, there's a part of my PPT that's in Portuguese. So it was a very fast technique. All they had to do was buy the liquid latex, mix it with ammonia, and then just apply in several layers on the rock. And when it would dry, they would have a cast, like a negative cast, a very moldable one. You could actually fold it and store it very easily. And this is how they managed to do a lot of these casts in a small amount of time. And why did they decided to use this methodology? First, because they didn't have much time. And second, because the way they organized themselves to do as much as they could in small parts of the time, they actually could manage to do 15, 20 casts per person per day. And obviously you can understand that they couldn't work for 2 years straight. So mainly in the summertime, because the casts need to dry very well before they are taken over the rocks. So they actually didn't have they didn't have much good conditions to do a proper work. In any case, I must say that they did almost a miracle because they managed to do 1,500 more or less molds of latex, and some of them were really, really big. So we have different sizes. We have small casts, and then we have gigantic casts with 4 meters, 3 meters. And they decided this would be very fast to have the copy of the rock. And then in the lab later, with time, they could study exactly what was in each rock in a proper manner. So this is the type of material that they actually had after 2 years, more than 1,000 of these latex casts. And this was also an advantage because when we do replics, or if we think we should do replics of sites or even tracing of a very big site, we have to bear in mind how we will store that material, okay? Even if they are plastics, if they are casts, if they are copies, whatever, or replics, we have to bear in mind that we have to keep that material in good conditions after. And this was an advantage because these casts were easy to store. They wouldn't take a lot of space. They actually were very well done. So after 50 years, we had the anniversary of the discovery of Tagus last year in October. So it's been 50 years since this work, and we still have the casts in generally speaking, in very good conditions, and we can see the rock art that it's there engraved. So this work that they did was gigantic, and they didn't do only the casts. They managed to do prospection, they did photography, they did fill sheets. So they were very well organized as a team, and each person had a different task to try to cover around 40 kilometers of terrain in 2 years, taking into account that they couldn't, or it wouldn't be very good to work in the winter. So this was a great work, and because of it, we still have access to the rock art of Tagus today. So in 1974, the dam started to submerge the rock art, and more than 90% of these engravings are underwater these days. There are 3 sites. Let me show you in the map. There are 3 sites today that we can still see outside water. The sites from Mação on the left part of the map, even if they are very influenced by the other dam, Percana Dam, still we can visit a lot of rock art in this small piece of the Crazy River that is a river stream that flows into Tagus. We can see a site that is right in front of the Fratel Dam, but it depends on the dynamic of the dam, obviously. Sometimes it's submerged. And we can still see rock art in the site near the Cedilha Dam. So the site that is closer to the border with Spain. When I see that we can still see rock art, it's like half a dozen rocks in each one of these sites, because the rest is completely submerged. And even these sites, probably not Mação, but most of rock art is very, it depends on the time of the year. If it's raining a lot, we can see the engravings. And the other 2 sites are very dangerous to be there, because the dams open without notice. So it happened that already happened before that we were doing some rock art work there, and the water starts to submerge us. Okay, so after 50 years or 40 years, this project started in 2009, 2010. What happened is that due to some political conditions in 1974 in Portugal, and then people actually went through different paths, all these latex molds stayed storage, but nobody actually studied them like a complete set, as a complete set. So they didn't do any corpuses. There were some monographic studies done, specifically in some particular rocks that had a big amount of rocks of different typologies, different chronologies. They were published as a rock. So there were some monographic studies. And then in 2010, there was a PhD thesis of one of the people that were in Tagus in the 70s, with an overall study of Tagus, but they didn't publish the entire set of the rocks. They just published a quarter of the material. So there was a more or less good idea of what was existing in Tagus, but the publications were not that many. So it was very funny, because this was a gigantic site of rock art in the middle of Portugal, probably the first professional archaeological work that existed in Portugal, and nobody knew about it, even in publications, even in academia. There were just a few publications about this, so it was completely unknown. So in 2009, 2010, there was a project here called Ruptejo. And we started this project because in the year 2000, there was a highway being built in this area. And some prospections were made in the Crazy River, and we found more rock art. So there was a general knowledge that more rock art was in this area, specifically in the Crazy area that was not yet very impacted by the dams. So the project needed to know exactly what Tagus had. We cannot study a small piece of this big assemblage without knowing the overall image of what was going on in this territory. So we started this project, Ruptejo, and we started for the basics. We asked permission to study the latex molds that were done in the 70s, and we had to apply a certain methodologies to actually do it properly. So we decided to look at these casts as they were normal rocks. And we applied the method of doing the tracing, the direct tracing with plastics. Doing this method is it's not just I put a plastic on the top of the mold or the rock and just draw over. There's a specific protocol of organization of the plastics in the top of the rock or in the mold. And in this case, we also had to work in a very specific conditions, because these molds only can be seen properly in a dark room with artificial light. So for some years, literally, we had to apply this methodology to the casts. And we also took advantage of the fact that there were still some rocks outside water. So we also did field work in those rock art sites, trying to apply the same methodology, but in the field, to the rock art that was still outside water. And it was very interesting because some of the rocks that we were working were never published before. So there were pieces and sets of rocks that were found after, and they were not known. They were completely ignored. They haven't been published before. So we actually were finding more and adding more information to this already big rock art site. So the first part of the methodology was to make a two-dimension tracing of these latex molds using this methodology. Why did we decide to do this instead of, for example, only photography? And we could have worked in digital tracing over photography. Obviously, because doing only photography and digital tracing over photography, we wouldn't have been touching a lot in this material. First, because they are still in very good conditions, and using the plastics actually didn't involve a lot of impact on these molds. And second, because they are only visible in a dark room with artificial light, it made it really, really difficult to do it just with the photography. So we had to move a lot the light to better see what was there engraved. So it was a kind of the conditions that we had to access this material. We decided to use this methodology. And obviously, taking always into account the conservation of this material. So no damage was made, even if we were using a direct methodology to do the tracing. So these are some of the schemes of the plastics over the latex molds and the way that they are organized. For example, and this is where some of these casts were not very easy, because some of them were really big. And then we could understand a little bit of the dynamic in the field in the 1970s. Some of the people there decided to do one cast per rock. Some of them decided to do a big cast in a big area and then divide by panels. So, and I understand this, of course, when you don't have much time and there are a lot of different people working in the same place, sometimes the protocol of approach doesn't follow the same rules. So it was also very interesting to see different ways of making the codes of the latex in the field in the 70s. Some people did it differently from others. And this is a case of one of the molds that from one mold, they consider different rocks. So the codes in the back part of the latex mold were different. And they are showing us exactly the different panels that they decided to put in this specific mold. They also tell us where north is pointing to and the number of the mold, even if the code here, it has to do with the rock itself and the panel. So some of these molds were very complex in the information that they were giving us. And we had to take that into account also when we were tracing. And then in the next part of organization of the material in the digital part. So the protocol of doing the tracing of these molds, we had to implement a protocol that would work in series. So there always have to be the same size of the plastic sheets. They always have to have the same code or the same type of code. We always have to bear in mind that we have to put a scale to know exactly the size of each mold after. And then here everything is black and white, but we use different color codes. For the engravings, one color; for the fractures of the rock, a different color; and then for the shape of the rock mold itself. We have to also take into account that comparing these molds with the rocks pictures, we know that some of them, a lot of them, don't correspond to the actual shape of the rock. So some of them, yes, for example, this could be the surface of the rock itself, and sometimes they would just do the mold where they would see rock art. So we can't have for sure the idea that the shape of the rock that we are seeing, the shape of the panel that we are seeing, is the exactly shape in the river. Okay, they would just use the latex where they would see rock art. So this is a very important aspect because normally in rock art works, we tend to know, specifically in older chronologies, but also in post-Paleolithic chronologies, that many times the engraver, the person that did the rock art, would take advantage of the shape of the panel and use it sometimes in the composition of the scene that they wanted to represent. So in this case, this is something that it's a lack of information. We cannot take and consider exactly the shape of the rock because probably they were just using it with the material constraint, material restrictions. They were using the latex just for the part of the rock art, not taking into account the shape of the rock. There are not many pictures published from the 70s because there was still a time that no reports were made. The material that they were making would stay in the personal property of the archaeologists. So in only some of the published works that some of them did after, they would put some pictures of the rocks. But the entire collection of photography of this work has not been yet published. So we had to work, and when we were trying to do the corpuses of Tagus, we had to take into account everything that we could to make the biggest collection of material of this site. So not only the casts, but bibliography, all the pictures that had been published in regarding Tagus rock art. Some of the pictures that had been published, for example, are they regard rocks that had not been that I couldn't find in the molds. Okay, so I know there are a couple of rocks that had a latex mold, but in some part of the last 50 years, either they got lost or they were stored in a different place. So I know that things that had been published, I couldn't find them in the mold. So I had to take into account what also had been published and compare with the molds that I was having. So I would have the complete collection of everything. Okay, after the entire collection of casts were drawn, and the field work in 3 different rock art sites that still had some rocks outside water. We end up with a big collection of plastics with drawings, and we had to also create a protocol of what to do with this on the next step. So there was a lot of work involved in the image digital treatment of this material. And basically, all of them were puzzles. We used different plastics to make one cast, and then we have treated as it was a puzzle to put it together in the same way that we see the actual cast. Bear in mind the parts that they would match each other, bear in mind the part that they had the scale, bear in mind that the casts show us the negative part of the rock. So for me to represent in the image what would be in the river, I had to put it upside down. So this was an important part, because this is how we would draw it. Okay, this is the image from the drawing, and this is the image that it's the actual position of the drawing in the rock in the river. And this was an important step, because if I forgot, or if we forgot about this detail, we will showing everything upside down, which would be a mistake. Okay, then steps of protocol in the digital treatment of all these rocks. We have to know how many panels we were dealing, organizing also by figures, making the counting of the figures, taking each figure one by one as an image. Because this work, even if it looks a little boring counting the images and taking one by one, actually it's an important step for analysis after, statistical analysis and counting of the figures and knowing exactly the typology of the figures and figuring out the different type of figures that we have and the superimpositions and associations between figures. This is crucial for us to not either only understand the dynamic of what is going on in Tagus Valley rock art, but also to construct a chronological framework for this site. So as more information we have on what is in a big area of rock art, more clear we can construct a chronological framework. And this is an example of how one of the molds that we have, that it's actually quite complex because they decided to put different panels in one mold. We end up by showing the final representation of this mold. And here we can see already a lot of different engravings or typology of engravings. We can see concentric circles, a circle with a line attached, simple circles, compositions of different circles, and animals here in the middle. And as much as you see rock art of the Tagus, you will realize that more than 19% of what they represented is schematic art, so art from the Neolithic, Chalcolithic, and Bronze Age. And inside this chronological framework of schematic art, most of the rock art is abstract rock art. So geometric circles, concentric circles, lines, spirals, things that it's very hard to get to the meaning officially of the meaning of what they were representing. We also have Paleolithic art and pre-schematic rock art that I will explain in a little bit. The construction of a chronological framework for a rock art site, it's not very easy, okay? Because when we look for the rock as one, everything looks very confusing. It seems that it's just a big random position of different figures that we can't understand when they were made or where they come from. So everything looks very different or very complex. And an important part of the study of a rock, especially if there's a lot of things engraved there, it has to do with superimpositions. Okay, like stratigraphy in an excavation. It's crucial to bear in mind that we have to be aware of the superimposition of engravings of different figures, even if we know or we make the assumption after that they belong to the same typology. They probably were made in the same part of the time. I can tell you, for example, if I have abstract figures in the top of abstract figures, I literally can tell you if they were made at the same time, in 5 minutes apart, in 2 days apart, in 1 month apart, or 1,000 years apart. I can't say that because my range of time for this specific typology, it's the same. But there are some details that we can do and we can assess, and to have a better knowledge of the distribution of the engravings in a chronology. And Tagus actually already had a lot of chronological proposals from different from other researchers. Chronological proposals came right in the 70s when they saw all these rock art. They already started saying there are things that are older than others, and there were 3 or 4 chronological proposals already set up in the 70s and in the 80s for Tagus. But I knew that because nobody had done the corpuses of Tagus, it would be very difficult to actually have a good and a little bit more clear chronological framework for Tagus, because the studies that were being made were concentrated in specific rocks. And I think it's a mistake for you to consider the chronology of 7,000 engravings, in each case it's the corpus of Tagus, just taking into account one rock, even if that rock has everything that is different in time. But I think it's very dangerous just to take into account one rock. So superimpositions here were a very important aspect of the analysis of the rock art, along with the statistics and the analysis of typology of rock art. And analysis of typology along with superimpositions actually gave us very good base work for our chronological framework. And you can see different colors to represent superimpositions, but they are not random chosen. It's just not like I put it a color because it looks nice and I see differences between figures. No, we created a color code of different levels, and for all the rocks that we were seeing that there were superimpositions happening, we adapt or we use that color code that was previous created, always in the same way. So I know that the first color would be always be the red, and after the gray, and after and blacks are always the most recent rock art. So a color code was created and applied as a series to all these superimpositions. And after you do this to some hundreds of figures, you can actually understand that this is how best you would understand what was going on in Tagus. Because if you don't do different color code, or you don't actually take into account superimpositions as a very important aspect of the analysis of your sites, everything looks that was made at the same time. Everything looks just a complex, random, confusing set of images in one rock. And when you start checking the layers of engravings, it makes more sense, because you can see patterns of things that were being drawn or represented first, and then different figures were coming after. And here are some examples, both of, for example, animals being superimposed by geometric figures, and this was a pattern, okay, but also happens geometric figures superimposing geometric figures, okay. In any case, this was also very interesting because with this exercise and comparing, for example, the beginning of the earliest or the engravings that were in the base, even geometric ones that were in the base of the stratigraphical layers of rock art of Tagus, you could compare them, for example, with things that were being used in the early Neolithic ceramics in many places. And there were patterns that were coming the same. So figures that were being used in different materials, archaeological materials, and that also in Tagus, and not only in Tagus, then you can compare with many other sites, they were the first ones to be represented. So this was giving us a lot of good things to work for the chronological proposal. Another important aspect of this work, of course, is a photographic documentation. Even this material is actually in very good conditions, conservation conditions. We have to bear in mind that it's already 50 years old since then. So we decided to make a very good photographical protocol to apply to all these materials with different lights, and also test some of the tracings using these photographic different assessments of each mold. So I think in the end, this was the first big work taking into account these molds, not only from photographic point of view, but also from the representations point of view. So we end up with the corpuses of, right now, it's 7,000 engravings in more or less 1,636 rocks. So this takes care of the molds, of the rocks that are still outside water, of the bibliography that we found, rocks that were published but they were not in the casts, of photographies that were made in the 70s, published but they were not in the casts. So we did the tracing of those photographies. We tried to reunite everything that we could find on Tagus rock art. So this is one methodology that can be used, applied for a very specific material, which is the latex molds. And it's quite rare these days to find material like this in latex molds. Another methodology that can be applied is, instead of using the plastic directly used on the rocks or in the casts, we use the photography. It's an indirect technique. Obviously, it's much better for the conservation of the rock. And then we make the tracing only digital. So we make the drawing of what we are seeing, only taking into account the rock photography and not the rock itself. Obviously, using this technique, we have to bear in mind some important aspects. For example, rock art is more visible or better seen depending on light, either artificial light or sunlight, but it has to be in a very specific time of the day that we have to photograph, or we have to create the conditions of artificial light to photograph and to really see all the aspects of the rock itself. But it's also possible, and today I would say that the most obvious choice for a lot of the rock art sites in the world would be indirect technique using photographic skills and then digital treatment and digital tracing of that rock art. So we also applied to some of the rocks that were still outside water this technique, and the results are also good. sometimes, and it already happened to me before in different contexts in some sites in Brazil, for example, that we chose to use both techniques because of the conditions that we had to work. So with the plastics, you would see some things. With the photography or with the 3D or with the drone pictures, you would see other things, and then we can combine to have the most accurate visualization of a rock. Okay. In Tagus, this was not the case. In Tagus, we used these both techniques, and they turned good, both of them. All the rocks, of course, are accompanied with a field sheet. Okay, there are many things, many aspects, not only for the conservation point of view that we have to bear in mind, but also for the study itself of statistically after the dimension of the rocks, the conservation state, if there were plastic tracing, yes or no, the amount of figures. The counting of the figures was done already in the plastics. Okay, we had to already put a number and have already an idea of the amount of figures that we were tracing. Obviously, that's after in the image treatment of all this material, we saw mistakes, we saw things that we have to cover up, but it already helped us from the start. So when we have the idea of what's going on in a big area and we have a big set of engravings, we actually can see some very detailed aspects of this site. So we realized, for example, everybody always said that only the engravings were only made by packing technique. And actually, there are a couple of rocks in the Tagus and some in the Erges River that were using different techniques, scratched or abrasion engravings. So there is not only one technique, there are two techniques in the Tagus, even if it's really, really small in percentage, the other technique. But this also is very important for the chronological aspect of it. And because I think it could be more, for example, but for example, if we had filiforms, so really thin scratching figures, I don't think they would be represented in the molds, or it will be very hard to see them. So I think this technique, there are more techniques in the Tagus, but because of the material that was used to do the tracing, to do the replics of the molds, I think this is an aspect that was lost in the general ideas of Tagus. Another thing that we realized is that there are different ways of packing. So, and this is very interesting because even in bibliography, other researchers already said before that they could see that some of the engravings in Tagus that were in the basis of the stratigraphy were remade over and over time. And actually, we can see very easily a difference in the packing style. So really thin packing, what I wrote as normal packing. So an average, not thin or thick packing style. And then we have figures that are really, really thick, really big. And normally they are in the basis of the stratigraphy. So there is this idea, and the researchers from the 70s actually said that they realized that many of these engravings, the oldest ones, were repacked over time, which is very interesting in some aspects. So in the end of these corpuses, we can have now a better and general idea of what's going on in this area in terms of rock art. We have 12 sites that are registered, okay? And we have to bear in mind an important information. The researchers that were there in the 70s, they say and they admit that there were more rock art sites, but they literally didn't have time to do everything before the dam starts working. So they focused on the biggest ones, the more complex ones. But even if today registered, we have 7,000 engravings, they said, well, there are many different records of that, but people believe that Tagus Valley rock art could be up to 15,000 engravings. Some people say 20,000 engravings. I'm not sure if it's that big, but at least the double, I could believe the double that we had time to register. Okay, so right now this is the corpuses of Tagus rock art, and the typology diversity is really, really big. There are many different anthropomorphic figures, many different types of animal figures, and from different chronologies. And then more than 90% of the rock art is abstract geometric shapes, like lines, concentric lines, sets of lines, circles, spirals, a lot of different types of circles representations. And then we have very specific things like shields, sun-shaped figures, weapons, things that it's very hard for me to say what it is. I know it's representing an idea or an object, but I can't relate it to anything that I know. And then symbols, really small symbols in the rocks. A lot of packing stains. Looks weird, but it's true. A lot of rock art was just as packing. It looks random, but when we look at the entire Tagus, we see that this was very typical, and there was sometimes patterns with the packing stains all over the Tagus. Then we have more recently some inscriptions, mainly from people that in the 18th century, 17th century visited the rock art and actually decided to do their own names and dates to the rocks. And just a couple of religious figures from those people. Normally these people would be priests, so they would try to Christianize the site with crosses sometimes. Just for you to have an idea of the diversity of typology of these sites, many different types of anthropomorphic figures, animal figures, very schematic, a lot of lines, different lines, concentric circles, a lot of different ways of doing circles, which is very interesting, with dots in the middle, with crosses in the middle, with lines in the middle. Then we have sun-shaped figures, which are also very important, and there are things that are quite similar with engravings that we find in megalithic sites, for example. So chronologically speaking, this is very important too. And then different things like sun-shaped figures, weapons, footprints. We have some too, shields, faces, that they look like faces, and just a couple of religious figures, okay? In the end, all this work was very, very useful to make a proposal of a chronological framework for Tagus, and a very important aspect of it, and especially because of not only the typology of engravings, but also the stratigraphy of the engravings. We propose that there is a preschematic phase. So we call it preschematic because it's before Neolithic. We don't know very well when, but we know that from the type of figure that is represented, and taking into account the overlappings of figures and comparing obviously with other materials in other sites, we made the proposition that there is a very specific type of engravings that were made somewhere between the end of the Upper Paleolithic and the beginning of the Neolithic. We decided to name it as preschematic. Some other authors already gave this proposal different names, but it's actually a type of rock art that it's starting to be discussed now among colleagues, and trying to see in other places this specific chronology of rock art. So if you want to know a little bit more about this topic, there are many things already published, including the corpuses of Tagus rock art. Okay, you can download it easily on the internet. And the novelty is that this is not a work that is ended, because we just now, I think we just now started. We know more or less well what's going on in Tagus Valley rock art, but there are many, many things to be done yet, even with engravings, associations, where they are located, how they are associated with the landscape, why they were made in that specific part of the valley. And because the work has continued, last year in the Ocreza River, the small stream that has rock art and already had the oldest engraving of Tagus, this Paleolithic horse here that we see was considered the only figure from Paleolithic chronology in all Tagus was in Ocreza. And last year, recently, just a few months ago, we decided to do a small excavation near Neolithic figures. We had a couple of questions that we need to solve there. We did a small excavation, and we found out actually it's a really small excavation, it's 4 meters for 4 meters, but here in this panel that we can see vertical, we found more, this is a 3D of the site. So this panel here in the middle, literally here, it's vertical. So the rest of rock art majority is on the horizontal panels. We found out there, where I was pointing, new engravings and of Paleolithic style. So the way they are represented tells us immediately, and in some of them without any doubt, that it's Paleolithic style engravings. It was a very big news that opened even more questions, because one of the big questions in Tagus was, in 7,000 engravings, why there's only one that is obviously Paleolithic? And the answer was, well, either there's more when we don't know it, either we are not looking for it, because mostly of the Paleolithic rock art normally are in vertical panels, not horizontal panels. So probably we are not looking for the Paleolithic rock art, but the answer came because we have to look it. Either we have to excavate it in the sediments of the river, or we have to start looking for the vertical panels of the edges of the Tagus, because nobody was looking for that. So this was a very big discovery, opened a lot of new ways of work. We will continue to do a project in Tagus taking into account this new discovery and the new engravings. And obviously, from the point of the methodological point of view, we are only now working, and because it's also, we have good conditions for that, only with digital treatment and 3D tracing. So now what we are trying to do is to apply a tracing directly to the 3D of the rock. Like, for example, this image of 3D of the Ocreza horse, and just to, in a very indirect way, to use the new technology, the new records that we can make with new technology, to apply the tracings to the 3D models. And then obviously we can use this in many different ways. We can use it for research, we can use it for dissemination, divulgation, publications for the public. This opens, using technology in rock art panels, give us a very big different set of opportunities, not only for study the rock art itself, but also to show it to the public. So this is, I don't have the tracing of this rock because literally this was found out just a few months ago, and we were working on this now and preparing the new project to expand the excavation. But these are the new opportunities that we have in front of us, and the methodology also adapts to the site, adapts to the new types of sites, and obviously the main part that we always have to bear in mind working with the rock art is the conservation of it. Okay, so this is my last slide. Thank you very much. I think I'm on time.
Thank you very much, Sara.